password?
I can. I didn't know if people wanted that because with a password, I think that you have to kind of sign up with Zoom. Uh, and I don't know that everyone wants to do that.
I
Uh,
think if I think most people would be enrolled in multiple classes. At least for my other classes, they all use passwords so that you don't manually have to go in and admit
okay,
everyone in,
that
and
is a
that way they could just join in immediately,
right.
um,
That's a good point.
and you don't have to waste your time like
And you don't have to waste
dropping
your time hanging for me to notice, right? Yeah. Okay, I will
something
do
like
that.
that. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I will do that.
works win-win.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Miss out on less too sometimes, but works well.
All right. Excellent. I will. I will indeed do that. Okay. So I see that most of you choose not to be seen, which is too bad for me because it's the only time I get to see you, but that's
I
your
mean, I'm smoking a cigarette. If anyone wants to see that,
I don't mind. As a former smoker
um,
years ago.
quick.
Okay.
That's good for you, actually.
It's
That's
good I
really
quit,
good for
but
you.
I admit that I still, all these years later, and it's like almost 30 years later, I still have dreams about smoking.
Oh no,
It is, I think it must
it's
be
tempting.
the most addictive substance in the world. It's so, and it's an amazing drug because it both calms you down and boosts
Waste
you
your
up
money.
at the same time. And it wastes a lot of money. Um, when I smoked, it wasn't as expensive, but I don't know how people afford it now. It's
It's
so,
$10 a pack.
that's incredible. I
It's a
remember,
luxury item.
I remember being outraged, and I was an underage smoker at the time, but outraged that it was 95 cents for a pack of cigarettes in a,
Holy shit.
I know, in a machine, in a cigarette machine. So yeah, you can that. So I've just dated myself, right? You can tell how old I am.
How much
Very
was
old.
gas?
What's that?
How much was gas?
Oh my God! It was well under $1.
Holy shit. You know, at
Yeah,
least it's dropping now to $3.
I mean,
You know, it's better than 5.
it was negative $33 not too long ago.
that's right. You're right. Not that it showed. I mean, that was yeah the cost for a barrel. Not that it showed much here. The prices didn't go down, but yeah,
So
they
nasty
were
habit.
paying people to take the oil because it was more expensive to store than it was worth. So
Interesting.
yeah.
Actually, I have a question related to cameras.
Good. Okay.
Um,
That gets us back on topic, right?
so I recently cleaned out my A6000 because I got smudges and um, pubes or little pieces of dust in my sensor whenever I take pictures. Um, and each camera is a little different, right? Sensor size, and I actually kind of wanted to start a side hustle cleaning other people's cameras. Um, have you have experienced cleaning multiple different varieties of cameras, sensor sizes, and lenses? And
I did years ago. I've never cleaned the inside of a lens because I'm not an expert, and you really have to be you have to know what you're doing with lenses.
Mhm.
I mean, cleaning the rear and the front elements, requires care, but
But the
not
sensor
any
is a different
previous knowledge.
story, huh?
And the sensor you can learn how to do relatively easily. You just have to be really careful.
Yeah.
Um, because once, if you get a scratch on the sensor, it's ruined. And the sensor is the most expensive part of the camera body, you know?
Yeah, that's why I want to get some research in before I'm messing with other people's
Right,
cameras.
right. So yeah, get a couple of, what you can do is get some dead cameras that, don't function for whatever reason, buy them cheap on eBay or something. and practice on those.
Mhm.
So, as you know, you have to lock open the shutter, and you can buy special cleaning fluid, I believe. But there's a special brush that is used.
Little swab.
Yeah, yeah, or swabs. But it's been many years since I cleaned any sensors, so I'm no expert. But I do know that you want to be really careful and know what
Yeah,
you're doing. And I think it's a good, it's a very useful and possibly somewhat lucrative business to start because,
it's definitely a niche.
yeah, yeah,
There's a lot of busy YouTubers out there who don't have time for that, and sometimes I come across their content, and they have pubes on their screen, and they don't have
um,
time for that. They have to plan their business.
it's true. Or the knowledge to do it, or or whatever. So yeah, I think that is a great idea. Um, and I used to know people to send you to find that out, but a lot of the photo stores, with people who really knew the stuff, have closed down. Um,
Unfortunately, yeah.
Unfortunately, yeah,
Especially with the rise of cell phone cameras.
yeah. Everyone's a photographer now,
Mm-hmm.
So, but I'm sure that you can find out a lot of stuff online, and I'm sure there's instructional stuff too.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm just so scared of
yeah.
messing someone's camera up.
Absolutely, and so I
Make,
think, yeah, getting some dead cameras uh, so you can practice might work well.
I thought that was a really good idea, and I think I might start off with that too.
Oh, all right, good,
Thank you for that.
absolutely. Okay, well, let's get started. Welcome back. I have posted some new stuff on Canvas. I hope you've seen it. Uh, let's see, we finished off talking about equivalent exposures, so I'll go over that again briefly so that we're kind of up to, well, reminded of what we did last week. And I don't know about you, but sometimes the weeks just kind of, when you're not doing anything else really, it's hard to remember where we are. And kind of amazing that it's a week away from Memorial Day. So, anyway, let me get over to where we were. Um, so I just have to find it, which on my horrific desktop can be a problem because I am really bad and I don't close windows because then I think I'll forget what I was doing, which is true. I do. Let's see here. And then there's stuff I don't even know how it got on my desktop. I'll have to blame my poor daughter. Well, I know what I'll do. Okay. Out of that and go to images. All right. So, can you all see these notes here? Great. Okay. So we had, of course, talked about the shutter and the aperture, the two mechanisms that we use to allow light into the camera, to control how much light enters the camera. And then last time, after reviewing those, we put them together. So, excuse me. So again, there are two mechanisms, the aperture and the shutter. The shutter controls the length of time light is allowed into the camera, and the aperture controls how long, the size, the aperture controls essentially the intensity of the light entering the camera. So, I'm so sorry. So we said the light meter tells us whether or not we're allowing in the correct amount of light. And so it indicates, there's an indicator somewhere on the camera, either in the eyepiece or on the LCD or on the back display or all of the above, whether or not you're allowing in the correct amount of light. And if you're not, then you need to adjust either the aperture or the shutter speed or the ISO rating or some combination thereof until the light meter tells you that you're allowing in the correct amount of light. So we used as an example a 60th of a second at f8 and set the ISO or the ASA rating to 400. And just as an example. So these combinations of numbers are not combinations that you should memorize because they are just hypothetical. They're possibilities. But we said that we went outside on a cloudy day with the ASA or ISO set to 400, and the correct exposure happened to be a 60th of a second at f8. So if we use this combination of numbers, the image will be properly exposed, neither over nor under exposed. But there will be many times, we said, that although we believe our light meter is functioning correctly and that this is a correct meter reading, there will be many times when we don't want to use that particular combination of numbers. So does anybody remember why we might want to change the shutter speed?
We changed the shutter speed to change the amount of light that can get in, or
True.
to freeze or stop motion, or to blur motion.
Right. So yes, when we change the shutter speed, we change the amount of light entering the camera. The reason to change, as you said, the reason to change the shutter speed in particular would be when we're dealing with motion or a moving subject. And if we want to stop or freeze motion, we would want to use a fast shutter speed. And if we want to show motion as a blur, we would use a slow shutter speed. In either case, a 60th of a second doesn't really cut it, you might say. It's neither here nor there. It's neither very fast nor very, very slow. So if we want to freeze the motion of Serena Williams serving a tennis ball at 125 miles an hour and capture that, freeze the ball midair, then we need to use a really fast shutter speed. Conversely, if we want to show the motion, a blur of motion, either of Serena Williams running or a dancer pirouetting across a stage or trees blowing in the wind or anything else, a 60th of a second is too fast. And if you want to show a blur of motion, then you need to leave the shutter open for a longer period of time. However, we know that when we change the shutter speed, we change the amount of light entering the camera. And so if we change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, we know that we've cut the amount of light in half. We've gone from a slower to a faster shutter speed. And when we cut the light in half, our image will then be too dark. We'll be letting in half as much light as the light meter says is correct. And of course, that happens each time we stop down. So if we go to 1/250th of a second, we'd be letting in 1/4 as much light, and then an eighth, and the 15th, and 30th, and so on, as much light as is required. So we said that in order to change the shutter speed but still expose correctly, we also will change the size of the aperture. So as we let in less light through the shutter, we'll let in more light through the aperture. So we'll go to a larger aperture. And again, the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the diameter of the aperture. So if we change our shutter speed to 1/125th of a second, we'll compensate for having cut the amount of light in half by opening up the aperture by 1 stop, which doubles the amount of light entering the camera. Yes,
Are
Samuel,
these two separate mechanical devices?
they are.
The shutter and the aperture? Like,
Yes.
so the aperture is one thing that opens and closes, and the shutter is the thing that closes all the way?
So the shutter is this window at the back of the camera, which you cannot see, of course, in the digital camera, at least from the back. You can see it from the front. And changing the shutter speed. So the shutter speeds are the settings, and they're described in seconds and in fractions of seconds. So this is 1 second. Then this is 1/4 of a second. And here's a 60th of a second. So you can hear that it's faster also. And they get faster and faster. So this is, let's see if I can angle it so you can see it. You can't even see it. It's
Is that
moving
the same?
so quickly.
What kind of camera is that? Sorry.
This is a cheapo
So there's
film camera.
film, mirrorless, DSLR,
So
and SLR.
So SLRs are single lens reflex cameras, as we discussed. So they have this mirror built into the camera, if you can see it, kind of, that allows us to see what will be recorded by the camera.
I see.
And there are digital SLR. This is a film SLR, and I use it for demonstrations because I can open up the back and show you guys the shutter, which you can't do with a digital camera. Mirrorless cameras are cameras that do not have the reflex mirror and allow light to pass directly through the lens back to the sensor. And there are advantages and some disadvantages, but advantages to having that. They're quieter, they're lighter, they can be faster, though at the moment I think they're not.
Do they?
But-
So, I could just pop off the lens, and I would just directly see the sensor.
You
Does
won't. You'll first see, if it's an SLR, first you'll see this mirror, which you'll need to lock up. And then you see the shutter, which you need to lock open. And then you can see the sensor, which is located where the shutter is, here, back here. Never touch it, by the way.
So if it's a DSLR, then you would see, what would you see?
So I just described what you would see with a DSLR.
DSLR. What about a mirrorless?
The mirrorless, I've never opened one up, so I can't tell you exactly what you'll see, but I am assuming you'll see the shutter
I
and
can
then.
show you.
Oh, there you go.
That's a sensor.
That's a sensor. Yep. And so you want to be really careful when you do that. First, you want to make sure the power is off on your camera always. Whenever you open it up, whenever you take the lens off, because the sensor has electricity going through it when it's on, and it sucks stuff in. It acts almost like a vacuum, and it will suck dust in. Even without the power on, you want to be really careful because once dust gets on your sensor, then it shows up in every image, which is why you clean it. So you always want everything powered down. Question, Baharak.
Uh, excuse me, when the aperture is larger, so more light comes in the camera,
Correct.
and the shutter speed gonna be faster?
The shutter, there are two different mechanisms, the shutter,
Yeah.
the aperture. So the shutter, you control the amount of light by changing the shutter speed, how long it remains open, right?
Yeah.
And that works independently of the aperture and opening and closing it. But you
Yeah.
use them together. So what I said was we changed the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second. So that's faster. It remains open for less time.
Yeah.
Half the amount of light comes in. And so we open up the aperture from f8, I don't think you can really see it, but to f5.6, which doubles the amount of light entering the camera. And so overall, you're going to let in the same amount of light. So these two combinations of numbers, a 60th of a second at f8 and 1/125th of a second at f5.6, let in the same overall amount of light. In the first case, you're letting more light in through the shutter because it's a slower shutter speed and less light in through the aperture. In the second, you let less light in through the shutter because it's a faster shutter speed, but you let more light in through the aperture because it's larger than f8. F5.6
Yeah.
is larger. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So together, one of them is larger. The shutters is gonna be faster. Yeah.
Yes. So one will let in more light than the other as you change
Mhm.
them.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
relative to each other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So back to the equivalent exposures. Equivalent exposures allow in the same overall amount of light. So you have, let me put it this way, sorry, as many whole stop f-stops your lens has, that will be the number of equivalent exposures that you can make use of. So my lens starts at f2 and then it stops down to f22. That's what this particular lens does. Your lenses probably start at f3.5, which is an intermediate aperture between f4 and f2.8. And your lenses may stop down to f32 or maybe f36, which is an intermediate f-stop. So your lenses may go to a smaller aperture than mine does. Your lenses probably don't open up as far as this one does, unless you have, instead of a zoom lens, you have a lens like this, which is a fixed focal length lens, or a lens that only has one focal length. So again, zoom lenses have many focal lengths incorporated into one lens. But with the equivalent exposures, the number of equivalent exposures that you can make use of, the number is determined by the number of whole f-stops your lens has. So mine has 8. So I can make use of these 8 combinations of numbers and know that my image will be properly exposed. So because all of these combinations are allowing in the same overall amount of light as my original starting point here at a 60th of a second at f8. So as I go to the faster shutter speeds, I open up the aperture more and more. So as I let less light in through the shutter, I let more light in through the aperture. In the opposite direction, if I change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to a 30th of a second, a 30th of a second remains open for twice as long as a 60th of a second. And so it allows in twice as much light. And if I just change the shutter speed to a 30th of a second, my image will be too bright. It will be overexposed because I'm letting in twice as much light as the light meter says is correct. And so I compensate for that now by changing the aperture from a larger to a smaller aperture. So if I let more light in through the shutter, I'll let less light in through the aperture. And that also holds true as I go down the line here. And so my lens stops down to f22. That's the smallest aperture that my lens goes to. And so the slowest shutter speed I can make use of is an eighth of a second at f22. Now, my camera may allow me to continue to open up to a quarter of a second or half a second, but now I no longer have apertures to compensate for that. And so now I'll be overexposing and letting too much light in. And then on this side, on the opposite end, the fastest shutter speed I can make use of is 1/1000th of a second, which is pretty fast. But I can't make use of the faster shutter speeds because my lens doesn't open up beyond f2. And most or many lenses do not. And essentially no zoom lenses open up that far. But again, I have these 8 equivalent exposures at my disposal that I can make use of, knowing that each of those will be allowing in the correct amount of light in this given lighting situation in which I'm photographing right now in this hypothetical situation. So whenever I change the situation, or if the sun suddenly comes out or something like that, that will change the lighting situation. And your light meter will indicate that. It will say, uh-oh, it won't say that, but it will indicate, uh-oh, you're not letting in the correct amount of light anymore. And you will then have to adjust the apertures or the shutter speed until the light meter again tells you that you're letting in the correct amount of light. So as with the slow shutter speeds, with the fast ones, the camera may allow me to change the shutter speed from 1/1000th of a second to 1/2000th or 1/4000th, but now I no longer have f-stops or apertures to compensate for that change, so I'll be underexposing, and that is not letting in enough light or as much light as the light meter says I need to do to make a correct exposure. Okay. Yeah, question?
When you're looking at the exposure through the histogram, and it makes a shape where it peaks on the very left and on the very right, what does it mean?
So the histogram is like a graph that shows, how much light there is, also how many, where the colors are. And the ends are the extremes. So generally the left, for you, the left shows black and the right shows white. And so if you have everything blocked up on either side, black and white, or light and dark, what that means is you're in a very high contrast situation where you have bright highlights and dark shadows and not much in between. And that's a very difficult lighting situation in which to photograph, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Because the light meter looks at the scene in front of it and evaluates how much light there is and it essentially gives you an average of the amount of light. It uses the information in the center as, you know, it gives more weight to the center and it looks at other elements in the frame. But if there's a huge, you know, if there's a really bright area, even if it's not in the center, then the light meter will say, too much light, you need to let in less light. And so in that case, the image will be properly exposed for the bright area, but then everything else will be too dark. Or if you have a big black blob, you know, really dark area in the frame, the light meter will then say, oh, it's way too dark, you need to let more light in to properly expose. Then that dark area will get lighter, but so will everything else. And then everything else will be blasted out, it'll be too bright. So again, those are high contrast situations are very difficult to deal with in photography because you can only make one exposure at a time. You can only set the shutter and aperture at one setting for one frame. Generally, it works out that if you expose kind of in the middle, that'll be okay. But that's not always the case. Okay. And there are things you can do then to after the fact to correct for that. Okay, so equivalent exposures allow in the same overall amount of light. Let's say that we want to, that an eighth of a second at f/22, which is the slowest shutter speed I can make use of, given the lighting situation and given my equipment. Let's say that's not a slow enough shutter speed for the effect that I want to show more motion. And we said that the lighting situation is what it is. I'm photographing outside, I can't change that. This is the only equipment that I have. What can I do that will allow me to make use of these even slower shutter speeds and still make an exposure, an image that is properly exposed, that's not too bright or too dark?
Wait, wouldn't the slow shutter speed let more light in?
Yes. So if I
Oh.
then change the shutter speed to an even slower shutter speed, I'll now be letting in too much light
So you
because I no longer have aperture settings to
Oh.
compensate.
Okay, so you would first you would increase your shutter speed.
But
and-
what I'm saying is I want to make use. What do I do? I have the
ISO?
equivalent exposures, but what do I do if I want to use an even slower shutter speed? And this is the only lens I have. It doesn't stop down beyond f/22. What can I do to expose correctly and still make use of these slow shutter speeds? Baharak? Are you- I saw your little box illuminate, so I thought you were going to speak. I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
Oh, bigger numbers or smaller aperture. Oh gosh.
It all gets very
Uh,
confusing, right?
No,
you mean we can't change the aperture size?
You
We
cannot
can't, no?
not after f/22 because my lens doesn't stop down to f/32, which is the next stop. That would be
Yeah.
the next whole stop. And my lens doesn't do that.
Would
So-
you use some sort of physical way in order to try to have less light come in? You know, like
Good.
opposite of the.
Ooh, the guys at the box.
So there are filters that I could use that we'll talk about a little later.
filter.
I could use a neutral density filter that blocks a certain amount of light from entering the camera, but I don't have one. So what can I do? What can I do? Anybody?
Change the ISO?
Yes, thank you. That's exactly right. Change the ISO rating. So the ISO or ASA rating tells us how sensitive the sensor film is to light. And when we change that, the light requirement changes, right? And we said that the lower the sensitivity,
Yes.
the more light is required, and the higher the sensitivity, the less light is required. So, in what direction would I change the ISO or ASA to make use of the slow shutter speeds, which let more light in?
Up. Higher number.
No.
No.
No?
So, lower number, we would go to a less sensitive setting because the less sensitive settings require more light. And we
Oh, are you-
want to
oh,
let more light in.
uh,
We want to use a slower shutter speed, which lets more light in.
ISO 100.
Right. 200 is the next stop, and then 100. So the numbers cut in half as they go down in sensitivity and double as they go up in sensitivity.
wait, you're trying to increase the amount of light getting into the camera?
Yes. By going from a faster to a slower shutter speed. So an eighth of a second is
Yes.
half of a quarter of a second. So lets in half as much light. Therefore, a quarter of a second is twice as long as an eighth of a second, and it lets in twice as much light. And that's what we want to do. And so going to a less sensitive setting, so let's say 200 instead of 400,
Oh, to keep the effect the same.
to keep the overall amount of light entering the camera the same.
Oh.
So that's what you want to do.
I was misunderstanding the whole equation there. All right, I got it.
Okay. Okay. So we will change the ISO rating from 400 to 200. And now our light meter reading, or our light meter, which said a 60th of a second at f8 was correct, will now say, you're not letting in enough light. Because when you decrease the ISO rating, you cut the sensitivity, and you therefore increase the light requirement. And we said the relationship is inversely proportional. So if we cut the sensitivity in half from 400 to 200, our light requirement doubles. We need twice as much light. So now a 60th of a second at f8 is underexposing, and we need to open up the aperture. We could change the shutter speed, but right now we're concerned, of just doing it with the aperture. You can do either. So now I'm going to open up my aperture to f5.6, which lets in twice as much light as f8. And now the light meter god will be appeased. That will be the correct amount of light entering the camera. All of the stops move over by one stop. So where we could make use of 1,000th of a second at f2, because we've decreased the sensitivity, now f2 moves over to 1/500th of a second. Because I opened up the aperture from f8 to f5.6. But all the numbers shift over by one stop in this direction. And so now, instead of an eighth of a second at f22, I can make use of a quarter of a second at f22. So I've gained one stop. And if I want to make use of a half a second, I can change the ISO from 200 to 100. And so I'm again cutting the sensitivity in half, and my light requirement will again double. So again, the light meter will say, you're not letting in enough light. So I'll open up the aperture again from f5.6 to f4, which is the next stop open. And now my numbers shift again, and the fastest shutter speed I can make use of is 1/250th of a second at f2. So I've lost 2 stops in the fast in the fast shutter speed area, but I've gained another stop, or a total of 2 stops, with the slow shutter speeds. So now I can make use of half a second at f22 by reducing the sensitivity, in this case by 2 settings or 2 stops. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions?
What scenario would you use this in with the low ISO and the low shutter speed and the high f-stop?
Any situation in which you want to make use of slow shutter speeds and expose correctly. So when I want to show motion, if I want to show my cat or dog running through the frame as a blur, not frozen in midair, but as a blur going through. So you need a slower shutter speed to make images of that sort. Now, if I were just to open up the shutter speed and let more light in, I would be overexposing by more and more and more. And eventually my image would just be white. So I compensate for that by changing the size of the aperture. But eventually, as you could see here, I ran out of small apertures. So the next thing to do is to change the ISO rating. And this example of 400 ISO at a 60th of a second at f8 is a possible combination of numbers, that you might get on a pretty cloudy day when there isn't as much light. On a bright sunny day like today, or it is here anyway, you'd probably want to be using 100 or 200 at most anyway. And in those cases, you would have trouble. Where you have a lot of light, you will have trouble using the slow, the slow shutter speeds. And in that case, you might need to use a neutral density filter, some way of reducing the overall amount of light in another way. Okay. Now, we can also, make use of the faster shutter speeds by doing the opposite, by going to a higher sensitivity rating, which requires less light. And the fast shutter speeds let in less light. So we would do the opposite. We would change, instead of going to larger apertures to make use of the slow shutter speeds, we'd go to smaller apertures to make use of the fast shutter speeds. Okay, so any questions on equivalent exposures? All good, I hope? All right.
Will we have to take an exam on this?
You always have to take an exam. Yes. So the exam, which will be given, not in finals, not on the final day, but just before it. The exam will cover all the technical stuff that we've talked about and that we are still talking about. So we haven't covered everything that will be on the exam, but certainly equivalent exposures will be on the exam. Yes. And the relationships between and among the shutter speeds and the apertures and the ISO rating.
Oh no, I'm worried.
It's all in the notes, and I'll go over it. I always do a complete review.
I understand how to do it with my hands, but not with my brain.
Well,
I mess with the shutter speed first, and then, do I need a still picture? Do I need a blurry picture? Do I need this much light? Oh no, I can't mess with that shutter speed or the aperture. Then I move to ISO, and
well,
then,
you're kind of doing what we're doing here. This is just, as they say, kind of quantifying it, You'll get it.
I'll figure it out.
That's the problem when you do something a certain way and then try and learn a new element to it, throws everything off. And for a while, you're like, oh my God, it ruined. It's like the tennis game. If you change something in your serve, for a little while, you can't serve at all until you incorporate that new thing in, and then it works, and hopefully it's better. And I find that's kind of how things work often when you're learning new stuff. For a little while, you get all discombobulated and you're pretty angry that this ruined everything for you. But hopefully it will then work out, and it will improve things for you and help you. And I'll go over it again, probably more than you guys want to hear. So, all right. Okay, so I think we talked about this, but your cameras have different settings: manual, aperture and shutter priority, program, and auto. And so in the program and auto modes, your camera does everything for you. In the manual mode, you have to do everything. So in the program and auto modes, you may not even be able to change the ISO rating, and you don't change the aperture or the shutter speed. The camera does it for you. In the manual mode, you have to change the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO rating. The light meter will tell you whether or not you're exposing correctly, but it won't correct it for you if you're not. In the aperture and shutter priority modes, you control one of those, and the camera automatically figures out the equivalent exposure for you. So let's say you're in the shutter priority mode, also known as the TV mode for time value. Some cameras use that designation.
Weird.
Let's say you want a specific shutter speed, let's say 1/1000th of a second to stop motion, then the camera will automatically set the proper aperture. It will figure out the equivalent exposures and set the correct aperture for you. In the aperture priority mode, you choose a particular aperture that you want to use, and we'll talk about that next, I guess, about that effect. But you choose the aperture, and then the camera will automatically set the appropriate shutter speed, again figuring out the equivalent exposures and setting it correctly for you. So I would like you to use at least one of the priority modes. If you don't feel comfortable using the manual mode, that's fine. You don't have to, though I hope you'll experiment with that. But do use one of the priority modes and not the auto settings, because the purpose of this class, one of them, is to learn how to use a camera, and you won't do that by using the auto or program modes. Okay. There are certain situations in which you might not want to do what your light meter says is correct. So earlier, when we're talking about equivalent exposures, we trust that our light meter is working correctly. We just don't want to use that specific combination of numbers. In this case, there are certain lighting situations where your light meter can be fooled, or can tell you to do something that you might not want to do. And so I've kind of badly drawn these out. The first situation is having a dark subject against a light background. So let's say it's a person standing in front of a bright window or door. And that's a difficult lighting situation where you have an extremely bright area and then a dark area. And the camera has to choose what to expose for, light or dark. It cannot expose correctly for both. And generally, when you have a lot of brightness in the frame, the camera will latch onto that, and it will say, too much light. It's too bright, you need to let in less light. And it will then expose correctly for the bright areas, which will throw the darker area into even deeper shadow. So what you'll get is a silhouette of your subject in front of this bright background, and the background will now be correctly exposed. So if you don't want that to happen, there are a couple of things you can do. The first being that you can you can move your subject away from the bright background. If you don't want that effect, it's a difficult lighting situation to deal with. So just move your subject. If you do want that effect, fine, go ahead and do it. If you want to keep that situation but expose correctly for the subject, then you need to walk up close to the subject and activate your light meter on the person's face, or on the person not getting the background into the light meter. And then back up and use that light meter reading, even though when you back up, the light meter will say, you're letting in too much light. And you'll ignore it and expose correctly for your subject. When you do that, because the subject is darker and you need to let more light in to expose correctly, your background, which is already bright, will get even brighter. So that's the trade-off that you make. If you expose correctly for the shadow areas, the highlights will be too bright. If you expose correctly for the highlight areas, the shadows will be too dark. So the opposite of that situation is having a light subject against a dark background. So let's say you have a person sitting in a darkened room that has one light source coming in from one window or an overhead light. In that case, the light meter will say, it's too dark. You need to let in more light. And if you do what the light meter says is correct, then your background will be a gray color instead of black. And your lighter subject will be way too bright. So in this case, you'll do the same thing that you did with the dark subject against a light background. And you'll walk up to the subject and take a meter reading just of the subject and use that meter reading, even though when you back up, the light meter will say, you're not letting in enough light. And you'll do that. The light meter reads the world in gray, and it will give you a light meter reading to render whatever you're photographing this kind of medium gray tone. It's also called middle gray, 18% gray, because it reflects 18% of the light hitting it. It's also called zone 5 if you've worked in black and white photography. At any rate, that's what the light meter reads the world in. And so it will want your white background to be gray. It will want your black background to be gray. And it will give you a meter reading in order to achieve that. The third situation in which you might not want to do what your light meter says is when you have a light subject against a light background. So let's say you take your fluffy white dog up to the Sierra in the snow, and you want to photograph the dog in the snow. The light meter will give you a meter reading to make that darker. It will say, that's too bright. And I want it to be gray, as it wants the world to be. And so it will give you a meter reading to let in less light than you actually need. And so in that case, you kind of have to know that the light meter may do this to you in snow or in bright situations. The nice thing about digital photography is that you can have instant feedback. So it's always a good idea to periodically check your images and see if they are exposing correctly. And this will immediately let you know that the light meter is, it's reacting, you might say, to all that brightness and telling you to underexpose. The opposite of that situation is having a dark subject against a dark background. So like my hair against my shirt. And it will say, that's way too dark. You want it lighter. And it will make my hair look gray and my shirt look gray, which I don't want. I want to be able to see the texture of each. So I don't want it so dark that they're like black holes, but I don't want it to be gray either. So in that case, you'll know that the light meter, again, is reacting to all this darkness and may want you to overexpose. And so again, you'll want to check that. Okay. Any questions? Okay, well, that brings us to our next little, I guess, topic, and that is something called bracketing. And bracketing is something that you do when you're in a difficult lighting situation. And it's something that you do to ensure that your image will be exposed correctly, even when the lighting situation is difficult. That is, that you have bright highlights and dark shadows. So let's say you're walking down the street in a city, and you happen to glance down into an alleyway, and you see some famous person, fill in the blank, in a very compromising situation. And you know that if you capture this act on your camera, you can maybe make a lot of money selling the image. Maybe you change the course of world events or some events by publishing this image. But it's in a difficult lighting situation. Alleys are dark, but they sometimes have very bright highlights coming through. And you want to ensure that you expose correctly, because your image is worth nothing if you can't tell who it is and what's going on in that image. So bracketing is something that photographers do to ensure that the image, that you get an image that's exposed correctly. And what you do is make 3 images of the same thing. One doing what the light meter says is correct. The second overexposing relative to that light meter reading. And the third underexposing relative to that light meter reading, with the hope that one of those 3 images will be properly exposed. So bracketing, this is in your notes. Excuse me. In the module that says equivalent exposures and bracketing. And so this is a description of what it is and what you do. But let's go down here and off to the right. I started with the same numbers that we used earlier. You may not use them again. You know, these again are just examples. So in this case, instead of figuring out equivalent exposures, I'm going to purposely over and underexpose relative to our initial light meter reading. So again, a 60th of a second at f8, and I called that n for normal. And now, when I change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to a 30th of a second, I'm not going to compensate for that change by changing the size of the aperture. I'm going to leave the aperture the same. And so now I'm overexposing by 1 stop. And in the opposite direction, when I change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, and I leave the aperture the same at f8, now I'm underexposing by 1 stop. So now I have 3 images, one doing what the light meter says is correct, another overexposing relative to that, and the third underexposing. And the hope is that one of those 3 exposures will be correct. I don't have to keep the aperture constant. I can change the size of the aperture and keep the shutter speed constant. So in this second set of numbers down here, I again start at a 60th of a second at f8. But for overexposing, I'll now keep the shutter speed at a 60th of a second and open up the aperture from f8 to f5.6. And so that is a +1 exposure. I'm letting in 1 stop more light than is required. And then in the opposite direction, to underexpose by 1 stop, I am again keeping the shutter speed constant at a 60th of a second, but I'm now stopping down the aperture by 1 stop from f8 to f11. So again, I have 3 exposures, 1 correct, 1 overexposing, and 1 underexposing. And again, the hope is that one of these will be correct. These 2 sets of numbers are equivalent to each other. They do the same thing, normal +1 -1. In the upper case, the shutter speed is changed and the aperture remains constant. In the lower set, the shutter speed remains constant and the aperture is changed, but overall, they do the same thing. But within the groups, they are not equivalent exposures. You can change the exposure in a couple of different ways. If you're in the manual mode, you can purposely change either the aperture or the shutter speed relative to what the light meter says is correct. Most of your cameras also have something called the exposure compensation dial, and it's a + sign somewhere on your camera body. And when you hold that in, it allows you to change how much light is let into the camera separate from what the aperture and shutter speed settings are. So normally this should be set at 0 so that everything, so that the shutter and aperture are doing what you think they're doing. But many photographers feel that they get better detail either in the shadows or the highlights by either over or underexposing by a little bit. And so this allows you to always over or underexpose without having to change the aperture and or shutter speed every time. So if you set it to a +1, the camera will always overexpose by 1 stop relative to whatever your light meter says is correct. If you change it to -2, the camera will always underexpose by 2 stops relative to what the light meter says you should do. And again, normally you want that set to 0, unless you decide for yourself that your images look better at a -3/4 of a stop or whatever. But this will allow you to bracket without having to go in and fiddle with the separate controls. You just fiddle with this control. You can also use, if your camera has it, the bracketing setting. So many SLRs, digital SLRs, have a setting for bracketing. And you go in there and you tell the camera what your parameters are. Do you want it to be 1 stop or 2 stops in either direction, or 3 or 4? Generally 1 or at most 2 is what gets used. 1/3 of a stop is so small, the change is so small that you won't really see a difference. So there's not really any point in bracketing by 1/3 of a stop in either direction. So at least 1 stop in either direction is what you want to do. Okay. So any questions on bracketing? Anybody? No? We're all good on bracketing? Absolutely. Okay, so I'm just going to start this subject, the next one, because we're running out of time, I think, a bit. But the next subject I want to talk about is called depth of field. And so we talked about the effect of changing the shutter speed on the image, and that is dealing with motion. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is the effect of changing the aperture, the effect on the image. And that is called depth of field. And, oh, right, I remember. Hang on one moment. So let me just get to where I need to be. Sorry. Okay, well, it should be here somewhere. This is irritating. Sorry. Huh. Well, that's not coming up. I don't know why. It's very irritating. All right, just one moment. All right, go back to this, sorry. And over here. This is all very slow, I'm sorry. Should be it. Okay. All right. So depth of field. So when you change the size of the aperture of the, located in the lens, you will change something called depth of field. And depth of field is the area or the amount of space in the image that's in focus from the foreground, that's the area closest to you, to the background, which is the area furthest away. So I'm sure you've seen images where one area is in focus. So let's say in a portrait, the subject is in focus, and then everything else is blurry. Everything behind, and maybe if there's something in front, that might be blurry as well. That is called shallow depth of field, where only a small portion of the total amount of space in the frame is sharp or in focus. The opposite of that is called great depth of field, where all or, most or all of the frame is in focus. So many landscape images, for example, are in great depth of field, where everything from, let's say, the little dog in the foreground to the background, the mountains in the background at infinity, everything is in sharp focus. So that's called great depth of field. And the primary way that we as photographers change the depth of field is by changing the size of the aperture. And the rule is the larger the aperture, and that is the smaller the f-stop number, so for example, f2, the shallower the depth of field, the less space is in focus. And as you decrease the size of the aperture, and that is you go to the larger f-stop numbers, f16, f22, f32, and so on, the depth of field increases. So the amount of space that is in focus increases, so that not only your point of focus will be in focus, but the area around it. So there's always a certain amount of space that's in focus. So let's say you focus on my nose. There's always a certain amount of space in front of my nose and behind my nose that is also in focus. And that amount of space is called the depth of field. And that can be a tiny amount of space or a huge amount of space. The ratio of that space, however, is a constant. And so of the total amount of space that you have in focus, 1/3 of it will be in front of your point of focus and 2/3 behind. So if you have a total of 3 feet in focus, for example, one of those feet will be in front of the point of focus and 2 will be behind. If you have a total of 9 feet in focus, 3 feet will be in front and 6 behind. So the ratio is the same, 1 to 2, or 1/3 to 2/3. Regardless, in general, regardless of how much actual space there is. It can be, again, a tremendous amount of space. So I'm just giving numbers here that are divisible by 3 because it's easier. But if you have 150 feet in focus, 50 of those feet will be in front of your point of focus and 100 behind, and so on. Okay. Okay. So again, the depth of field is the area or the amount of space that in the frame that is in focus. Specifically, it's the amount of space in front of and behind your point of focus that is in focus. And again, the primary thing that we use as photographers to change or control the depth of field in the image is to change the size of the aperture. And so the smaller the aperture, that is the larger the f-stop number, the greater the depth of field, the more will be in focus. And the larger the aperture, and that is the smaller the f-stop number, the shallower the depth of field. And again, here's a description of depth of great and shallow depth of field. Why is this? When light enters the camera, the light that we deal with is reflected light. The light from the subject enters the camera and it's focused at a point of the lens that we said is called the nodal point, and is then projected back into the camera where it's intercepted by the film or the sensor, the digital sensor. But unless you're photographing a subject in darkness, that is, one bright subject and there's no other light, light from other elements also enters the frame. So if you have a flower in the foreground, a house in the background, or whatever, light from those areas also enters the camera. But since they're at different distances from the point of focus, that is, sorry, the nodal point in the lens, they focus at different distances. And these different points of focus from these different areas are called circles of confusion, which I think is a great name. And because they focus at different points, either usually behind, but sometimes in front of your point of focus, they appear out of focus. When you close down the aperture, all of that light is forced through a smaller hole. It's kind of bundled together. And as it's bundled and forced and squished through this tiny aperture, these circles of confusion are forced to come in closer to the actual point of focus. Or excuse me, the focal point in the lens. And as they come in closer and closer, they appear to be sharper and sharper. They never actually reach that point, but they come close enough with a small aperture that they also appear to be in focus. As you open up the aperture again, those points move away from the focal point and appear out of focus again. So that's why it happens. What you really need to know is that it happens, and what happens when you change the size of the aperture. That's not supposed to be there, sorry. The second thing that affects the the depth of field is the length of the lens, the focal length of the lens. And the general rule is the shorter the lens, or the more wide angle the lens, the greater the depth of field, the more will be in focus. And the longer the lens, the more telephoto the lens, the shallower the depth of field will be, the less will be in focus. And that's because although all lenses have certain f-stop numbers in common, so for example, all lenses have f8, f11, f16, the size of the aperture is not constant from lens to lens. That changes depending on the focal length of the lens. So let's say we have two lenses, one a 24 millimeter lens, a somewhat wide angle lens, and an 80 millimeter lens, a mildly telephoto lens, and both are set at f8. The diameter, the size of the aperture, and you don't have to know this, this is just for your information, the diameter is equal to the focal length of the lens divided by the f-stop number. So if we take 24 millimeters and divide that by f8, by 8, we get 3 millimeters. If we take 80 millimeters and divide that by f8, we get 10 millimeters. And so f8 on the 80 millimeter lens, the longer lens, is more than 3 times as great as f8 is on the 24 millimeter lens, on the shorter lens. And we know that the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field, and the larger the aperture, the more shallow the depth of field. And that's why you get greater depth of field on a shorter lens and shallower depth of field on a longer lens. Because although both lenses have f8, f8 is not the same size on these lenses. The size of the aperture is dependent on the focal length of the lens. Okay. So what you really need to know is that a short lens will give you greater depth of field and a long lens will give you shallower depth of field.
Can you stay on that page?
Sure.
Oh,
And this is on Canvas, okay? All this on Canvas for your browsing pleasure, I guess.
A longer lens, shallower depth of field.
Yes. So on your zoom lenses, if you have a zoom lens, most of you do, you'll be doing a comparison, and that's the first assignment, is the depth of field assignment, which I'll go over in a few minutes. Right. So if you look at your images, you can look at them immediately. You take them. When you change the focal length of the lens, stay in the same place and keep the same aperture, you'll see this change in how much of the field in front of you is in focus. Okay, are we done with this page? Okay.
almost.
Oh, all right. Again, this is on Canvas, so you will have access to this. Okay, well, I'll start talking anyway. The third thing, there are 3 things that affect depth of field, and the third thing is how close or far you are from your point of focus, from your subject. So the distance from your point of focus. And the further away you are, the greater the depth of field, and the closer you are, the shallower the depth of field. Okay, I'm going to change that now. And that has to do with the angle of the light entering the camera. And when you're very close to the subject, the angle of view here is large, and it's hard for lenses to focus with a very large angle. So you may have noticed that your camera will not, or your lens will not let you focus closer than a certain point. often at about 18 inches. It just won't focus anymore. And the longer the lens, the further back you'll have to be. And again, it's difficult for lenses to focus with a great angle. And you can think of it as it's all the lens can do to focus at that aperture, and other things, or at that angle, excuse me, and other things just will not be in focus. Even when you change the size of the aperture and the focal length of the lens, when you come in very close to a subject, the depth of field will be shallow. Not that the other things won't affect the depth of field. You can have even shallower depth of field. But when you're very close to your subject, the depth of field, you will almost never be able to achieve great depth of field. But as you move away from your subject, that angle decreases. As you can see here, it gets smaller. And as that happens, more and more of the frame will be in focus. So the depth of field will increase. So 3 things that affect depth of field: the size of the aperture, the focal length of the lens, and the distance from the point of focus or your subject. Again, what we use in photography to purposely change the depth of field is generally changing the aperture. But these 2 other things, the focal length of the lens and the distance from the point of focus, also affect the depth of field. So I think that's it there. Oh, that's not what I want. I want to get out of here by closing that. So your first assignment is depth of field. And this should come up here. Ignore the due date here. So I have given you a description of depth of field again. Note that changing the depth of field will change, it may change the composition of the image. So when you change the focal length of the lens and when you change your distance from the subject, the angle of view that you have that's recorded will change. The assignment: you're going to make 3 sets of images, one for each of the things that controls depth of field. And so I want them in 3 different situations. But what you do need to do is find situations where you have space going back in the frame, like a classroom or out in a yard or something. Because if you just photograph from like my face to this wall where there's, maybe a foot or so, you won't see a change in how much is in focus. It's too close. So you need to find situations where you have a lot of space, and not just empty space, but with things or elements or people or plants within that space. And so for the first set of images, you're going to make 2 images, one showing shallow depth of field, one showing great. You'll change the size of the aperture. So for shallow depth of field, you'll use the largest aperture that your lens is capable of. And for great depth of field, you'll use the smallest. So here I say use the extremes. So don't just change the aperture by 1 stop, like from f5.6 to f8, because the difference will be so subtle you won't really see it. So use the extremes. You're going to keep your focal length the same. You're going to keep your distance from the subject the same. You're going to keep your point of focus the same. So if you focus on your sister for the first image, you're going to focus on your sister who's in that same place in the second image, changing only the aperture, and you may have to change the shutter speed as well if you're in the manual mode, because again, if you think back to our equivalent exposures, when we change the shutter speed, we have to change the aperture. When we change the aperture, we have to change the shutter speed. And you're going to do the same thing for the next two sets, in that you will keep one of those constant and change, or two of those things constant and change the main thing that's affecting depth of field. So for the second set, you're going to change the focal length of your lens. Most of you have zoom lenses, so use again the extremes, the widest angle portion and the most telephoto, keeping your distance from the subject the same and keeping your aperture the same in this case. So set it like f8 and then change the focal length. So it's a good idea, I think, to use the aperture, the aperture priority setting for this assignment, so that the camera will automatically figure out your equivalent exposures, but you have control over the aperture.
I have a question.
Yes.
So ideally, for each two photos of the three sets that we're gonna do, so the lowest aperture, one photo with the lowest aperture setting and one photo with the highest aperture setting, correct?
Only for the first set.
Only for the first set.
Yeah, because in the first set, it's the aperture that you're using to control the depth of field.
Okay.
In the
and then for
second set, you'll change the focal length of the lens to change the depth of field. And so in that case, you'll keep the aperture the same, maybe at f8, and your distance from the subject the same, and you'll be changing the length of the lens. And that will change the depth of field. And then in the third set, you'll change your actual distance from the subject. So you'll keep the aperture the same, let's say at f8, and you'll keep the focal length the same, let's say 50 millimeters. And then for shallow depth of field, you'll physically walk in close to your subject. And for greater depth of field, you'll move back. And, maybe 10 or 15 foot difference to show the change in the depth of field.
what if we don't have a zoom lens and we have a fixed
If you have a fixed focal length lens, let me know. If you have two different fixed focal length lenses, then swap them out.
Yeah, okay, yeah. That's what I was gonna say. Because I have a 50 millimeter and I have a 16 millimeter.
50 and 60? You won't see a big change, but go ahead and do it. Let's see what you get.
16.
Oh, 16. Oh, yeah, you'll see a big difference
Yeah.
there. Okay, great.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, that'll be fine.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
So meanwhile, we're changing the aperture. You also want us to balance out the exposure too, right?
And that's why I'm recommending that you put the camera into the aperture priority mode, so that when you change the aperture, the camera will automatically change the shutter speed for you, so that your image will be properly exposed. Okay.
Got it.
So it will be figuring out those equivalent exposures that we figured out earlier. Okay.
Excuse me.
Yes. Bahara. Yeah.
For the first set, for the first set, we have to change the aperture only.
Yes.
Yeah, and the distance has to be how much?
The what?
The distance and focal length.
So you can decide on the focal length. Let's say you decide 35 millimeter focal length. Then
Okay.
keep that the same for both of those images,
I got it.
and
Thank
only
you.
change the aperture. Right. And the shutter, you'll have to change the shutter speed also. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Anybody?
And
I'm still
excuse me?
trying to get used to using my camera and stuff. I'm messing around with it I'm not quite.
And that's what
Well-
you need to do, is mess around and fiddle around and and look at the results that you get when you do that. So,
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Right.
I'm still trying. Hello. Yes, I'm still
Yep.
trying to figure out exactly how exactly I'm what to do, because I can see from the class we were doing today how what we were learning, but oh shoot, but I just don't want to mess. I'm using a borrowed camera, so last thing I want to do is just mess it. Oh god.
well, again, figure out where, the different settings, and on the top of the camera, you'll have the manual mode, aperture. It may say AS for aperture or AV for aperture value. And you want to put it into the AV mode, or a aperture priority mode.
Maybe
And then when you change
mode
the
and-
aperture, the camera will automatically
how do I get to-
change the shutter speed.
How do I get to that, to the AV mode though?
So on the top of the camera, there's probably a dial.
Yeah.
My camera came with a really good manual. If you don't have the manual, you can maybe look up the model of the camera, and it might have all the info on like how to change the different
It
stuff.
should, yeah. Just go to the manufacturer's website and look at the
yes, right.
information
You're right.
for that model.
But it's going to be different on every camera.
Generally, yeah. Though most of them have a dial, but not all of them. It's true. Some of them you have to go in electronically and change it, and you see the change on the display.
Just did AV mode.
So A or AV mode, yes. Yeah, Bahara.
When I try using aperture priority mode,
Yeah.
it turns my shutter speed to 5 seconds.
Well, you're in a darkened situation. Your aperture is small, and maybe your ASA is too low. So
The ISO. The ASA is the ISO, right?
ISO, ASA, same thing. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So try
I think
upping that.
I'm gonna try upping the ISO. I think you
Open
can
up
actually
the aperture.
you can do that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Because
And
I was
you-
trying to take it with a aperture at 22, and the ISO.
Oh, yeah. So that's a tiny little aperture, and you're inside, right? And and maybe your ISO is down at 100 or 200, and so you need to let a lot more light in. And the only way for the camera to do that in that situation is to use a really long shutter speed.
Oh,
So if you open
when
up
you're-
the aperture and let more light in through the aperture, you can make use of a faster shutter speed.
So when you're in A mode or aperture mode, the only thing that is automatically set for you is the shutter speed.
Correct.
And, so that means you could choose the ISO and the aperture.
Yeah, unless you have the ISO set to auto, which I don't want you to have. I want you to change the ISO.
Okay.
But if you have it in the auto setting, then the ISO may change for you.
Cool.
Okay. Bahara, yeah.
Excuse me, for assignment, we have to explain what we do. For example, about the photos, we have to explain, or?
Yes, and I see that it didn't get onto this, but I will give you, I'll show you exactly how I want you to submit the images. And so what you'll do is change the title of the image. Usually it's a number, of whatever your camera's number is. I want you to change it to say what you've done. So it will say, maybe it'll say shallow depth of field f3.5 or great depth of field f22. Shallow depth of field 80 millimeter lens. Or great depth of field, you don't have to write lens, 18 millimeters, something like that, okay? And then the distance, maybe 1 foot and then 10 feet. So I want you to put that in the title or the name of the image, so then I'll know what you did, and you don't have to submit a separate paper or a document telling me what you did. I'll know what you did. Okay. Obviously,
Okay,
I'd like you to kind of keep track and know what you've done, you know, so how you got this effect, what you did to get. Was it changing the aperture or was it changing, you know, one of the other things?
Would you be, do you have any of the sample images? that
I'll
you took?
post those. Yeah, I will post some,
Amazing.
so you know. Yeah,
Amazing.
yeah.
When is, sorry, excuse me. When is the due date?
The important thing, right? So it's 1 week from today. Okay. So that will be, what is today? The 8th, shoot. Today's the 18th, so that'll be the 25th, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? That's Memorial Day, isn't it? Well, I'll give you Memorial Day off. You can have it due Tuesday.
Tuesday? Oh, okay.
Right, Tuesday the 26th. Okay.
Do we have a class next week? Zoom meeting? next
Maybe
week?
we'll do it on Wednesday if that works for you guys, because I think it is good to have to at least check in once a week, you know. But I don't want to ruin your Memorial Day. Not that most of us are going very far, but still, it's a holiday, right? So
Sorry, this is next year?
next Tuesday, a week from tomorrow. Week from tomorrow, okay? And I will post examples of what I'm talking about. All right.
Yes. Thank you.
Any other
Yeah.
questions?
And you'll have office hours. Let's say like we can schedule an appointment with you at any point in time. Like I can email you and.
You know what I meant to post? Wednesday would probably work best because I can't do it like whenever, all the time. So let's say Wednesdays from 12:30 to 2:30, if that works for people, or
Okay.
12 to 2. I'll post it, and I will be on Zoom. I'll send you the invitation. And I'll be here. You don't have to check in, but if you have questions, that'll be like coming into my office, so to speak.
I got thousands of questions.
All right.
So I have a question about the written assignment. I was wondering, like, what is the topic? What is the subject that we have to talk about? Is there any specific thing that we have to write it about? Do you have any information that you can give us right now?
You mean,
Yeah.
did you say for the reading?
For the written assignment, the assignment that we have to write, something like
Oh,
that.
the writing assignment. So, yeah, I will post that. Since we can't go to any museums or galleries, I'll have you watch. You'll have a choice of
Just real quick.
of movies to watch, and you'll write about one of them. Okay.
Oh, good.
A lot of
Carolyn?
galleries are actually doing digital tours right now.
That's true. Some of them are. Okay, I'll check and see what they've got. All right, because obviously I want you to go to a photographic exhibit, and that sounds really obvious, but I have had people write about statues and sculptures, and paintings. So, but I'll find out what's available. Thank you, Carolyn. Okay. Any other questions? Anybody? No, we're good here. Yeah. Okay. Well, excellent. Have a delightful weekend. Hope you can do something enjoyable anyway, right? And again, email me if you have questions, and I'll post the.
Yeah.
I will post the office hour. Okay, hours. Yeah, that's it. Okay. All right. Good. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.